about the SVM, how the vectors help us to analyze the margins and hyperplane information with respect to some vectors. So SVM, we have seen vectors, we have seen margins, we have seen distance margins, we have seen hyperplane. So therein we analyze that how a supervised learning algorithm of SVM can help us to analyze the data to get a better output solution. So depending upon that, we observe that it will be useful for us to understand regarding it is useful to understand regarding to analyze the optimal solutions. So before going to the matrix, a small definition here. A support vector machine is a discriminative classifier which takes training data, supervised learning, the algorithm outputs an optimal hyperplane which categorizes the new examples. So with respect to this, we see in the SVM that how the multiple data inputs are taken into consideration with respect to any particular input data, and it is being classified. Yes, ma'am? Okay. One second. Hello. Can you now hear me properly? Oh, okay, better. So we have seen in SVM in the previous classes that it is useful for both classification and regression. And we have observed that it finds an hyperplane that best separates different data classes by maximizing the margin between them. In SVM, we also have seen in the previous classes by using SVM, we mostly see that if we see how the complex data affects the data structure that are used mostly in the special areas like image recognition, NLP, and medical. So here we have some terms like what we have seen in the previous classes: hyperplane, margin, support vectors, kernel trick. So these are the parameters that are being used in a SVM. So here in the simple graph over here, we have a black dots, we have a blue squares, and these are categorized into two different categories, and we have to see that how much accurate, how much difference is there between the both the categories of data. So we have one type, first category of a SVM to be performed is called as linearly separable data. What exactly the linearly separable data will be doing is that it draws a line between these data points, classifying the black dots and the blue dot. That is, it will give a neutral point or a margin point to give a classification between two different data sets, like one black dots and blue dots. In this way, I'll separate a data. So this is a simple linearly separable data where we have two categorization of data where we have linearly separable and non-linearly separable. Linearly separable is like all the category of a data is at one place and another category of a data is one place. I categorize into two different aspects where in non-linearly separable data we have a collection or random in data input with respect to multiple data sets. At that instantly where we have different data sets where they are not classified into a proper linear fashion or equilibrium fashion, we have this type of a separable data that is called as non-linear separable data. So here you can see this in a non-linearly separable data. I have all stars, I have all red I have red dots. All this are being represented, and here what I can see is that I can categorize either in two ways, either from the hyperbola side, either from the x-axis side or either from the y-axis side. When I'm going with the x-axis and y-axis, we observe that here we have two categories of a data where we respect to inform that the two category of a data are useful for both the categories. And another thing is that when we are talking about non-linearly SVM, and another thing is that when we are talking about non-linear is that it is a type of SVM that can handle data where the classes are not linearly separable. That is, meaning that they cannot be separated by a straight line in 2D. So in the linearly, we have seen that we are separating the we are classifying a data with respect to classification where similar values are there, or with respect to regression where independent values are there. In linearly separable, we can do linearly separable with respect to 2D dimensions. Whereas or hyperplane. But when we are talking about the non-linearly, they achieve this by using kernel functions. That is, here we now, because we don't have a simple function, linear fashion, we come to important aspect where we make up kernel. A kernel will have the information of the different types of data set into classification. With respect to that, the data can be classified. So they achieve this by taking here non-linearly. What will they do is that they'll achieve this by using kernel functions to transform the data into higher dimensional space. So from one format of data to the other format of data, it can be classified or it can be transferred so to have an analysis where linearly separable data becomes much explanatorily or much useful. In simple word, if we talk about a kernel, because here in SVM as well as regression, we have talked about kernel. I will give you a small example or small introduction to this kernel. So what exactly the kernel will be doing is that it uses linearly separable kernels enable SVM to work in higher dimensions where data can become linearly separable. So what the kernel will do, it take all that one type of a data set into one category, another type of a data set into one category, and it will classify a data to analyze to classify a data into different tricks. And normally, kernel tricks can be used for the transformation, mostly for because of it computes the dot product of the data points in the higher dimensional data. So for this purpose, we use the kernel tricks to imply the 2D data or 3D data type. So here you can see one example of type 2. Here we have a raw data. We saw some dots, and we see here that the data is there. Some two dots are there, black dots that can be separated, showing that one category of data is one side, another category of data is one side. So as we have discussed in the previous slide, the same come across here. So above you have seen that we have a line, linear equation, linear line that separates two different category of a data set. But in one category, one same data set of data set one is being present. Now this has to be understood by using with respect to a outliers or a distance margin, what we have discussed in the previous classes. And also one more thing is really is like in a nonlinear classification, it refers to categorizing those instances or those data sets that are not linearly separable. So mostly we focus only on nonlinear data. Some of the classifier that use nonlinear functions to separate classes are like quadratic discriminant classifier, multi-layer perceptron, decision trees, random forest, and KNN. So these are some algorithms that use the nonlinear separable data. So from the above figure from the previous data line, if you use hyperplane, what happens is that two black dots also fall in category of blue squares that we have discussed just now. Data separation is not perfect. That is because of the one category where black dots and blue squares are available at one place. Data separation is not perfectly done. It too relates it tolerates some outliers in the classification. What it tolerates, that is, some error is being malfunctioned at the classification where we see that the blue squares are being mixed with red two black dots. Now what I have to do is that I have to do a separation. This type of separator bus provides a classification. How does it do? But it is quite difficult to train a model like this. Now for us only for two small data set or for two values of that information of the data set, I have to again train it, I have to analyze that, and again I have to rectify that error. So this is a quite difficult problem, but still this can be termed as regularization parameter. So we have here in the parameters, tuning parameters in SVM, like we have kernel, regularization, gamma, and margin. So these are some parameters that are being focused to evolve the classification of linearly data to the non-linearly data to the linearly data with respect to getting a less outliers, that is less margin. So the first one we have a margin. This we have discussed in the previous yesterday class, so last class also a margin is a very basic perpendicular distance between the closest data point and the hyperplane. That is, it is on the both side. As we have discussed in the previous class, we have two margins. How much it is being closed with respect to left side data as well as to the right side, that much distance margin is being analyzed. The best optimized line hyperplane with maximum margin is termed as margin maximal hyperplane. And with using by doing this, the closest points where the margin distance is calculated are considered as the support vectors. So when the margin is calculated with respect to different hyperplanes, at that instance we see that we create a margin distance which calculates the support vector, that which support vectors are mentioned respectively to analyze the data from one side to the other side. So here we have maximum margin decision hyperplane. So with respect to this, we see that how the data is being analyzed. So we have here two categories of a data, one are black dots, one are triangles. When where we see that three black dots and two triangles are coinciding to one hyperplane. With respect to that, we see which are the support vectors. So one is black dot as a support vector, one is triangle as a support vector. This determines that what is the two different vectors that are being played role. With respect to this, I create a hyperplane. This dotted lines are the hyperplane, and this is called the dark line, which we are seeing between, is called as a margin. So maximum margin decision hyperplane. So it sees the difference between this side of the hyperplane as well as this side of the hyperplane. That is, the margin distance is being calculated to the complete hyperplane to analyze that which data set values or which points of values are being coinciding at phase 1 or the phase 2 values. So this is the way the support vector machine is being utilized. This is for the purpose of only for where we are seeing related to the margin aspect. That is the parameter margin where we are accepting it. Second one, we have a regularization. Also, the C parameter in Python's scikit-learn library optimizes SVM classifier to avoid misclassifying the data. Another method when we are talking about SVM, where I'm just classifying a data with respect to the separable common values. If I am also going with classification of a data with SVM, at that instance, I can go with the regularization, where I see that margin of hyperplane is small means the C is small. C is large. If the margin of hyperplane is large, means C is small. That is, misclassification has been happened. Depending upon this, what happened? The C is large. That is nothing but chance of overfitting of a data. When C is small, there is a chance of underfitting of a data. You have an example. You can see here. I am having x1 and x2 as axis, where I have red balls and green plus signatures. With this, now I have to analyze that what type of data comes in what category. I categorize the data into two sections. One is red dots, one is plus green color. Now, when I'm making a classification, I make a margin. This dotted line is like a margin, and the light gray lines are the hyperplane. Now, at that hyperplane area, we observe two data sets of two different categories are aligning to that particular section. Depending upon it, here we say large value of parameter C. So, we here we can see that maximum at left side, maximum at right side, but these two are overlapping the region, the margin region. The next one is like we have another category for data where red balls and plus are there, and here we see with respect to linearly separable in a distance factor, where we have a small value for the parameter C. So with respect to that, we see that I can use normally linearly separable value to analyze the differences between the two different data sets. Then we have gamma. The above one was only for margin, another was related to regularization. Regularization represents the data of regularizing the method of that input data. Then we have next one is called gamma. It defines how far influences the calculation of plausible line of separation, low gamma, high gamma. Here we'll take an example. Here you can see it this two difference. There is a difference. There is a we'll check out the difference between the each particular value closest to that particular another data set type of a value, where we see that how much high the gamma value is, how much low the gamma value is there. Depending upon this, here we see an analysis that it defines how far influences the calculation of a plausible line of separation. Depending upon this, we classify into two types of a gamma. One is low gamma, another is high gamma. Low gamma represents that points far from plausible line are considered for calculation, whereas points close to the plausible line are considered for calculation. So these are the two categories of a data. With respect to this, we see that how the data or how the analysis of a gamma function implies it. Next, the very important, see above three categories of margin. gamma and regularization effects on linear data sets or a classified data set. But if I'm having a unclassified data where I have to apply the dependent independent values with respect to the classification or regressions, at that analysis, another methodology that comes across in SVM to be used in the mostly aspect where high dimensional data are used, where I want to have the same type of data set or same type of dimensional data. At that instance, I use a kernels. Kernels are used to classify data from low dimensional data to the high dimensional data. The mathematical functions for transforming a data using some linear algebra. Different SVM algorithm use different types of kernel functions. What are the various kernel functions? We have different various kernel functions like linear kernel, non-linear kernel, radial basis function, sigmoid, polynomial, exponential. So these are the different types of SVM algorithms that are being categorized with respect to kernels that are being utilized. As I said that before, what we have seen in the previous sections like gamma regularization and uh, gamma regularization and what was it? Sorry. Margin, yes. Gamma regularization and margin, where we say a low dimensional data or sequence data is being provided. But when we have a high dimensional data, we go ahead with the kernels to analyze the classification of data with respect to transforming a data or categorizing a data into a most effective manner with the calculations of different types of kernels. So we have these categories of a kernel types. So example here, you can see here, kernel function can be classified x comma y equals to f of x or f of y. What is f of x comma f of y? This is the dot product of n dimensional inputs. Why do we use this? We use this for this purpose to analyze that how much better the calculation function can come across. So here we have it works really well with clear margin of separation. The kernels will be utilized much better when we have a clear margin of separation of two different data set with respect to the hyperplane. It is effective in high dimensional spaces. As I said that where we have a high dimensional data types categories, at that instance it is more effective. It is effective in cases where number of dimensions is greater than the number of samples. Number of dimensions means the number of ways the way data like 3D plane, hyperplane, maximal plane, pooling way. At that instance it is much useful. It uses a subset of training points in the decision function called support vectors. That is, here we said when we are training the data set into multiple ways, we get a subset where I get an effective content of a data set from a predefined data set. So it is also useful for us for the next enhancement of our processing of our data set. Cons, that is what are the problems like it does not perform well when we have a large data set because the required training data is here. When we have a large data set to classify from the low to high dimensional data, it gets a very difficult problem to analyze the categorization of the data. Where because we have some dimensions and number of sample data set will be more. It also does not perform well when the data set has more noise. That is where we have a noisy data, the overlapping or the regression overlapping or any problems occurs where again in the regularization we observe some outliers. In SVM, it does not directly provide probability estimate. These are calculated using an expensive five-fold cross validation. So we have an applications called as we have one app technique called as five-fold cross validation that performs on to analyze the best data type of inputs. So these are the applications that are being utilized in SVM: face detection, classification of images, bioinformatics, handwriting recognition, generalized predictive control. So these are the real-time applications of our uh, SVM. So we have a code, simple example here. Let I use series from scikit-learn, matplotlib are the plots, kernels, linear and RBF. And the file which I am using is SVM file. Link to code is here. We can have a look for this file. So this is a explanation for SVM different types of data sets. So with this, we have completed our third unit and you can have a look for the programs related to this coming Saturday. And we'll be seeing on how to work out with the SVM different types of algorithms related to linearly or non-linearly separable data. Is it clear? And then they just go with this. Also, you can also work on this one also. This, as I said, for the tutorials points, you can have a look here. The tutorials points also, tutorial point 5. I'll go data set into different clusters, that is nothing but kernels, and we plot it with respect to some, what is the CMAP? Here you can see one thing, from sklearn data set, sample generator import make blob. That is, I'm having a lot of data set, big data set, say blob data set as data type is used. X comma Y of make blobs where we have 100 samples, where center is equals to 2, random state is 0, cluster is 0.5. Centers are two different X and Y centers I'm using. Scattering the data, here I have CMAP equals to summer. I have to choose some vector point. That vector point is nothing but summer. With respect to that, I will categorize the data into two classifications. So here we have this one, CMAP of the summer. We see that how the data is being classified. So here you can see that the two different data sets are being classified into linearly separable formats where we have marginal hyperplane. Why we are getting these three lines are depending upon the linear calculations related to the line space, where I'm saying as minus one. Minus one represents equilateral value, zero value, and the negative aspects of value. And next, you want to show the plot, you are giving some colors, and with respect to the colors what you have designed, it will give me the output here. So this is the way where we see basic SVMs can be utilized. We have the SVM like linear kernel, polynomials kernel, radial basis of gamma, radial basis function. There is a gamma function being utilized for the kernel operations. So this is the example of here. This is the simple explanation for your SVM classification, pros and cons. So kindly answer your calls, roll calls. Roll number 2, 3,